Did you know that one of Apple's biggest fails was a social media network that it launched in the early 2010s? This is the wild story of Ping, how Apple tested Facebook's patience, how Facebook killed their product, and how Apple got revenge. In 2010, Steve Jobs announced Ping, a social network for iTunes that he was sure could be the next big thing. Ping was sort of a mix between Twitter, Facebook, and iTunes. You could follow any artist or person you wanted to create a circle of friends. You could share your favorite parts of a song. You could see a top 10 chart from the people that you followed. It had big-name endorsements, too, from artists like Coldplay's Chris Martin and Lady Gaga, and in the first 24 hours, it gained 1 million users. But there was one big thing missing from Ping that made it basically useless. It didn't integrate with Facebook, which made it really hard to find your friends and connections. It was so important that for 18 months, Steve Jobs tried to convince Mark Zuckerberg to allow Ping to work with Facebook. The famously private Steve Jobs even went so far as to invite Mark Zuckerberg over so they could have dinner and hash out the Ping problem. According to sources, Facebook's attitude towards Apple was, quote, abrasive. And this was a big shock to Steve Jobs. But to understand why, we have to go back a few years to the founding of Facebook. Back when Mark Zuckerberg was just starting out as the CEO of what's now called Meta, Steve Jobs was actually his mentor. They had a lot in common. They both founded big tech companies in their younger years. Zuckerberg felt like he could ask Steve Jobs any question, and there weren't too many people who had been in Mark Zuckerberg's shoes, so that advice was invaluable. But when it came to Apple's foray into social media, Mark Zuckerberg clearly felt that Steve Jobs had crossed a line. Not being able to connect with Facebook was a huge problem because one of the biggest complaints about Ping was that it was almost impossible to find your friends, which a Facebook integration would have completely solved. I've heard a lot of people say, why didn't they just access the iPhone contacts? Don't forget, this was 2010, which was very much the early days of smartphones. The technology wasn't there. And even if it was, not that many people even owned an iPhone at the time. To put it bluntly, for Ping to succeed, Apple needed Facebook. But these negotiations between Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg were going nowhere. So Apple decided to beg for forgiveness instead of asking for permission. After Ping launched, Apple put a Facebook Connect login on Ping without having a deal with Facebook. Predictably, Facebook got a little crabby, and they responded by allegedly blocking Apple's API access to Facebook. All of the static between two of the world's biggest tech companies basically destroyed any chance that Ping had for success. Not to mention it had its own issues with spam and fake accounts. So in 2012, then new Apple CEO Tim Cook saw the writing on the wall and he killed Ping. But that's not where the story ends. Apple still had one more trick up their sleeve. Current Apple CEO Tim Cook and Mark Zuckerberg do not get along. You might even go so far as to call them each other's nemesis. You see, Tim Cook and Mark Zuckerberg have two wildly different versions of what the future of privacy should look like on the internet. While Facebook, now Meta, want a free and open internet where advertisers pay for customers' data to fund companies like Facebook and Instagram. But then in 2021, Apple announced a new iPhone feature that Facebook saw as a declaration of war. It required apps to get a user's express permission to track them across different apps. And a whopping 96% of Apple users did just that. No tracking means no data for Facebook to sell to advertisers. Apple's new privacy features significantly undermined Facebook's revenue and contributed to the company's stock falling more than 70% in 2022.